Most people do not have a motivation problem. They have an inconsistency problem. They show up for 3 days, then disappear for 4. They start strong, then vanish the moment the work becomes repetitive. Not realizing this cycle of inconsistency is what is keeping them stuck. Because inconsistency destroys more than momentum. It destroys trust. You stop believing your own word. You stop respecting your own standards. That is why so many people stay trapped in the same life for years. Not because they never try, because they never stay. They leave when it gets boring. They leave when it gets hard. And every time they leave, they train weakness. That is the real cost of inconsistency. It keeps you close enough to your goals to talk about them and even feel like you're making progress, but never close enough to touch them. It keeps you busy enough to feel like you are trying, but unstable enough to never truly change. And underneath all of it is comfort. Comfort is what inconsistency protects. Comfort is the reason you stop. Comfort is the reason you delay. So what looks like laziness on the surface is often something deeper. It is a man who has made comfort his priority. That is where the real problem begins. This is why laziness is never harmless. It is not just a bad habit. It is a slow erosion of identity. Because a man who keeps avoiding hard things does not move forward. He becomes slower, easier to distract, easier to pull away from his own purpose. And once that habit is formed, it touches everything. How he works, how he thinks, how long he can stay with something before quitting. That is where most men lose. They leave when what they should have done is work. That is the law most people hate. Consistency is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is often boring, lonely, repetitive. And that is exactly why it changes your life. Because the man who can keep showing up when the work loses its shine is the man who separates from the crowd. Anyone can move when they feel inspired. Anyone can have one good week. But the world is not changed by bursts. It is changed by repetition. By a man doing what matters long enough that his life begins to build around it. That is what consistency really is. Not a productivity trick. It's a code to live by. A way of living that says, my mission does not answer to my mood. That is the shift. Because most people still live the other way around. Mood first, mission second. If they feel good, they move. If they feel tired, they delay. But that is not how a man changes his life. A man changes his life when he stops asking how he feels and starts asking what must be done. That is why discipline beats motivation every single time. Motivation is fragile. It depends on conditions. It depends on emotion. But discipline does not care. Discipline gets up. Discipline keeps going. And if you are honest, that is what you really need. Not another speech. You need standards strong enough to survive a bad mood. Because a weak man always needs motivation. But a strong man moves anyway. And if you can do that, then that is where life starts to change. Not when everything aligns. When you do. When you stop acting as if consistency is optional. Because it is not. Consistency is the whole game. Greatness is buried under a mountain of days you do not feel like showing up for. And most people never reach it because they keep mistaking boredom for a sign to stop. It is not. It is part of the path. The path to success will be very boring at times. It will feel monotonous. But repetition is not punishment. It is construction. Every day you rise when you do not feel like it, you build something. Every day you finish the task you wanted to avoid, you get closer to your goal. At first it looks small. A day, an hour, one decision, one completed task. But small things repeated without interruption snowball into an unstoppable force. That is how momentum works. It stacks. And once it starts stacking, something changes in a man. Once a man starts seeing the first bit of progress, it becomes addicting. He stops needing the work to feel exciting. He stops being the kind of man who starts over every week. Because now he is becoming someone who simply does not leave the fight. That is the real goal, not intensity. Identity. Because consistency has to become identity. Not something you try to be. It has to become the kind of identity that says, this is what I do. I rise, I work, I train, I finish. That is the kind of man life starts responding to, because the world rewards execution, not potential. Potential impresses people for a moment, but execution changes everything. There are men with less talent than you, less resources than you, yet they are more successful than you because they stayed consistent, because they repeated the work, because when things got boring, they stayed focused. They understood that the boring days are where separation happens. That is why you must stop respecting your excuses. They may sound intelligent. They may sound reasonable. But time keeps the record. Time sees every skipped session, every delayed task, every morning wasted, every broken promise. And time does not return those moments. That is why comfort is the real enemy. Because at least failure can teach you something. Comfort just keeps you asleep. It makes you okay with less. But that is a dangerous way to live. And at some point, if you are serious about this, you have to speak to yourself plainly. You are not tired. You are undisciplined. And that it is costing you. That truth should not offend you. It should wake you up. Because if discipline can be lost, it can also be built. That is the hope inside all of this. You are not fixed in weakness. You are trained into it, which means you can train out of it. One hard task at a time. One completed promise at a time. This is how a man outworks his past, not with one heroic week, with 1,000 ordinary decisions made correctly. That is what changes your life. Not talent, not hype. Consistency. Consistency when it is inconvenient. Consistency when it is quiet. That is where transformation happens. Because every time you keep going, you cast another vote for the man you are becoming. And eventually, those votes become who you are. A man with discipline. A man with standards. A man who no longer wastes his life negotiating with comfort. That is the deeper reward, not just results. Self-respect. Because there is peace in knowing your life is no longer run by your lowest impulse. There is power in knowing you can trust your own word again. That is what consistency gives back to you. And once a man has that, his whole life begins to move differently. He walks differently, works differently, speaks differently. Because he is no longer building himself only when he feels like it. He is building himself as a way of life. So if you want your life to change, stop waiting for the feeling. Stop waiting for the version of you that suddenly loves hard work. Just move, even when you're tired, even when you're bored. Because motion destroys laziness. It destroys inconsistency. And the man who keeps moving long enough eventually becomes someone laziness can no longer recognize. That is when your life starts to shift. Quietly at first, then all at once. Because you finally became consistent enough to deserve the life you said you wanted. So protect your mornings. Finish the hard tasks. Do not run from repetition. Let your standards decide, and hold them long enough that discipline stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like identity. Because in the end, the people who change their lives are rarely the most gifted. They are the ones who kept showing up, again and again and again, until consistency became the kind of man they were.